Welcome to Malicious and Mysterious. Today we have a story that is both malicious and mysterious. Today we are talking about the ghost of the Great Salt Lake. Spoiler alert, he's not a ghost at all. And he likely didn't spend too much time around the Salt Lake, but you know how legends go. So our story takes us back to Salt Lake City in 1862. But before we go there, let's go back to 1847, July 24th to be exact. For those of you who are not in Utah or Idaho or Wyoming, July 24th is Pioneer Day in Utah. Why? Because that is the day that Brigham Young and 147 other people reached this beautiful valley in between all these mountains, and Brigham Young allegedly said either this is the place or this is the right place. And the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints decided that this is where they were going to settle, and they became the first non-Native American people to move into the area and stay. Before they arrived, there were some trappers and Catholic priests that had come through the area, but none of the non-Native American groups had stayed and set up shop until the LDS arrived. So this is actually pretty interesting. So they arrive in what will eventually become Utah Territory in 1847. But the funny thing is that they go there. Now they're trying to get away from persecution in Missouri and Illinois, and they show up. And at this point, the land that would eventually become Utah, it was very much frontier land. Like I said, people would pass through to get to California, but they didn't really stick around. Part of the reason is because this area was actually owned by Mexico at the time when they showed up. Well, the Mormons settle, and they actually found the state of Deseret in 1849. And then in 1850, Congress establishes the Utah Territory, and it becomes part of the United States because Mexico loses the Mexican-American War, and that territory goes to the United States. So while the Utah Territory was a religious place, it was no shrinking violet. It was just as rough as it was religious. Before we get to John Baptiste, we have to go back to 1861. Now, in 1861, Governor John W. Dawson was appointed by Abraham Lincoln. So this was a territory, not a state. It just become part of the U.S. So Abraham Lincoln appoints a governor. And Dawson, he's a lawyer, a farmer, and a newspaper editor who is now moved into politics, and he's from Indiana. So he allegedly made grossly improper proposals to an LDS widow. Now this upset people in the area, and he tried to flee the state. So he takes off, and he's headed, he's trying to get out of the Utah Territory, and he ends up stopping at a Pony Express post. When he's there, he's told, okay, you're safe. Don't worry about it. You're out of there. You're out of Utah. But he wasn't. And a group of young LDS men beat Dawson, allegedly castrating one of his testicles and beating him about the head and chest. The four men claimed they had been working under orders of the Salt Lake City police chief. Porter Rockwell, who was an assassin and is also known as the Avenging Angel, led a posse to find the men responsible for beating the governor, and the posse ended up killing 3 of the men when they were trying to escape custody. So the men were trying to get to California, but 3 were killed, 1 was captured. So when one of the people that was killed was Moroni Clausen, and so Moroni, his body was not claimed by his family, and he was buried in a potter's field. It's not clear why his family didn't initially claim his body, but a few days after the city of Salt Lake buried Clausen at their own expense, his relatives began to arrange for him to be reburied in his family plot in Draper, Utah. Moroni's brother, George, came to collect his body, and when the coffin was opened, it was revealed that Moroni was naked and face down. Obviously, George was not very happy with that. He was livid that his brother had been buried in such a way. He thought it was very disrespectful, and he took the matter up with Henry Heath, a Salt Lake City police officer. Now, Heath, he didn't believe what George was telling him, and he said, quote, "No such thing. No pauper ever had better or cleaner burial clothing than Roan. I bought them myself," end quote. So Roan was Moroni's nickname, I guess. So Heath started an investigation, and he goes to the cemetery sexton, and he's like, "Hey, what is going on here? Moroni Clausen he was buried naked and, face down. What happened here?" Well, obviously, the last person to see the body would be the grave digger. So the cemetery sexton gave Heath the grave digger's name, Jean Baptiste. So Heath headed over to the Baptiste residence, where Mrs. Baptiste told them that John wasn't home, but she invited them in. So it was Heath and a few other officers. So this is where they make the shocking discovery that there are boxes of clothing stacked throughout the house. This was especially alarming to Heath because he'd recently lost one of his daughters. And he could see these were soiled boxes of clothing. And as soon as they saw that, they made the connection. Moroni Clausen was naked because Baptiste had taken his clothes. He had robbed the dead man. So Heath's thoughts go immediately to his daughter, who he's recently lost. And he's just thinking, oh my gosh, did he take her clothes after she died? And in an interview in 1863, Heath told the Deseret News, quote, "I feared her grave too had been desecrated, and that her funeral shroud was among the motley sickening heaps of flesh-soiled linen we found in the grave digger's hut." End quote. So Heath and the other officers, they rushed to the cemetery where they found Baptiste. Heath immediately accused Baptiste of grave robbing, and Baptiste starts to cry. He's denying the accusations, but Heath, he says, quote, "choked the wretch into a confession while he begged for his life as a human being never pleaded before. I dragged him to a grave near my daughter's and pointing to it, inquired, 'Did you rob that grave?'" End quote. Initially, Baptiste says yes, but he really focuses in and, makes sure that Baptiste knows that he's talking about this particular grave that has a mound of dirt over it. And he asked the second time, and Baptiste said that he hadn't robbed that grave. Heath said, quote, "That answer saved the miserable coward's life," end quote. Word spread fast around town that the gravedigger was also a grave robber. And people who had loved ones who had been buried in the Salt Lake Cemetery were horrified. Police took Baptiste into custody and started asking him which graves he had robbed. A crowd of people formed outside the cemetery, and eventually, because of the, publicity and shock and awe of the crowd, Baptiste stopped identifying the graves he'd robbed. But it is believed that he robbed about 300 graves. Crazy. So the clothes from the robbed graves were actually set out at the courthouse for people to claim, which is strange. Eventually, those clothes were just buried in a mass grave in the cemetery because honestly, who wants the soiled clothes from their dead loved one? I mean, we know that dead bodies don't just stay intact after death. So, I mean, eventually just bury the clothes. So who was this grave robber, John Baptiste? Well, that's a good question. According to the 1860 census, he was born in Ireland, But there were rumors of him having been born in Italy. And Heath, the police officer who interrogated him, said that Baptiste was a Frenchman who came to America from Australia. So if he was a Frenchman who somehow ended up in the United States from Australia, I mean, wow, that's a lot of traveling at this time. So he, in Australia, I guess that he joined the LDS church. And so a lot of people were joining and they would pay your passage over to the United States. So that's how he ended up in Utah. Wherever Baptiste was from, it seems that Salt Lake City, they really wanted to make it clear this man was foreign. So there was, speculation that, hey, he's from Europe somewhere. This is how they behave. So, like they have a different view of death and things like that because Brigham Young, he was the LDS church president at this time, he had to like calm people down a little bit. And it's very interesting because Brigham Young seems to have complete control over what happens to Baptiste, even though Brigham Young is not in law enforcement, he's not in the government at this time. He is just the LDS church president, but there's not record of really any trial or anything for Baptiste. Brigham Young, he actually gives a speech at the Tabernacle in Salt Lake City, and he says that, killing Baptiste would be too kind, and then keeping him in jail isn't appropriate. And what he ends up suggesting is that they could brand him, let everybody know that he's a thief, and then they could send him out to what Brigham Young at the time calls Miller Island, which is what we know as Fremont Island today. It's an island in the Great Salt Lake. So Brigham Young goes on to tell people they're concerned because among the Mormon faithful, they are concerned about their family members who passed on Resurrection Day. They don't have clothes. So the concern was that the deceased, they would be at a disadvantage when it came to resurrection. What if they didn't have any pants on Resurrection Day? Well, Brigham Young, he assures them that everything will be fine and the dead have not been hurt by this. Everybody will be clothed on Resurrection Day. So they carry out the punishment for Baptiste. He is branded on his forehead, and it says, branded for robbing the dead. And that's tattooed on his forehead. And then he also has like his ears doxed like a dog. I don't know why they did that, but they like cut a piece of his ear or something. I don't know. So after they do that, now it's time for him to get out to Fremont Island. Now, originally he's taken to Antelope Island by the policeman Heath, but boatmen, they take him to Fremont, where a couple residents of Davis County, they were grazing cattle. So Fremont Island is rather bare, as are all the islands in the Great Salt Lake. The islands, they have like short kind of brown grass and little to no trees. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Fremont doesn't have any trees. And that's because the islands are the result of the ancient Lake Bonneville receding. So this was an inland sea, so very salty, and it receded. So it used to cover the Great Basin, pretty much, like Utah, portions of Idaho, and Nevada. And you can actually still see the shoreline along the mountains here. We even have the shoreline trail, and it goes along where the shoreline is still visible. So Baptiste is taken out initially to Antelope Island, and then a couple days later he ends up on Fremont. Some boatmen take him out there, and on Fremont there's cattle and a little cabin. So Baptiste is there by himself, and the plan is the guys that have the cattle out on Fremont Island, they go out there to check on them every 3 weeks. So that's what they're going to do. They're going to go out there every 3 weeks, and while they're checking on the cattle, they'll check on Baptiste. Very simple plan. So the first time they go out there, they say he's doing fine, they check on their cows. Baptiste is doing well. Obviously, there's cattle there. He's helped himself to some cattle. They're like, okay, fine. What else is he going to do? No big deal. And they say he's getting along. Well, the second time they go out, Baptiste is gone. He has killed a 2-year heifer, and part of the cabin is dismantled. It was assumed that Baptiste built a raft and floated to parts unknown. Now, at this time, the Great Salt Lake was actually pretty high, so it's not like it is today. Like today, there are parts where, like I actually just heard a story about the marina. People can't keep their boats there because there's just not enough water. Like you can't have your boat there right now. We don't have the water for it. But at this time, in 1862, the Great Salt Lake is pretty high. So yes, Baptiste could have built a raft out of the pieces of the cabin and the skin from the cow and sailed away. Makes sense, right? Because he's not found. His body doesn't wash up anywhere. So it makes sense that he just took off. And why not? Why would you want to hang out on an island in the Great Salt Lake? Also, the Great Salt Lake, I don't know how it smelled back then. There was more water. But I can tell you that, like, the Great Salt Lake, it is a marvel. But it is not a good smelling thing. And if you're living there, I mean, if you can get away, it's a good idea. So he's gone. They can't find him. He's just gone. Now, there are stories that a skull was found a few years later. And then there's another one about a leg bone with a shackle attached to it being located downstream. And this is where the ghost stories come from. So legends claim that the leg bone and the skull, those are remains of Baptiste. But Heath, the police officer who was responsible for transporting Baptiste, he said he wasn't shackled. So we know it's not his leg. Even so, a few sources I came across assume that Baptiste died, even though we don't have evidence for that conclusion. I mean, sure, it's possible. But at the time, the Great Salt Lake was high. So him sailing away from Fremont Island makes a lot of sense. Also, as a side note, there's a few other interesting things about this story. First, John W. Dawson, the governor of Utah who gets beat up, he was the first biographer of the man who would become known as Johnny Appleseed. I thought that was pretty cool. Also, Fremont Island, if you want to get a look at what it is like, HeavyDSparks and Diesel Dave, HeavyDSparks used to own the island. And they have this great video about one of their excavators getting stuck out there because now the water has receded a lot more over the past 10 years or so. So there are it's like this quicksand on Fremont Island. And there's not, originally I think that HeavyDSparks was going to try to develop the island, but it's just not, it's not worth it. And he learned it the hard way. He said everything he took out there just got ruined. So, it's a great video if you can find it. It's about his excavator, Fremont Island, HeavyDSparks, good stuff. But it'll give you an idea of what this place was like, pretty desolate. So I find it so interesting that this is categorized as a ghost story because it doesn't read like that. But you know how legends are. One of the best sources that I found for this was a book. It's called In Another Time, Sketches of Utah History, and it's by Harold Schindler. It was published back in 1998, and it had a chapter on the Baptiste situation. So it had really good reference. There's a movie about this situation. I hesitate to say that it's about Baptiste because it's called Redemption for Robbing the Dead. And the movie seems to be more about, kind of more focused around the police officer, Heath. It came out in 2011. And it looks like a really good movie, by the way. It's not, I couldn't find it streaming on any of the regular streamers or whatever. But it was made by a film director who teaches at Brigham Young University. And it looks like it's really put together well. And if it was streaming somewhere, I would totally watch it because I like Westerns. So, and it has that feel, so. But it does take some liberties. I can tell that just from what I saw of it. I watched the trailer and I read up on it. And so Baptiste was not on Fremont Island very long. And one of the liberties that I think the movie takes is that they want you to get this feeling that Heath, the police officer who interrogates Baptiste and gets the confession and all that stuff, they want you to think that Heath was very empathetic toward Baptiste. Now, that's an interesting take for a number of reasons because, number one, in the movie, it looks like Heath is going out to help Baptiste while he's on Fremont Island. And I don't know that Baptiste was there that long. I mean, like, so basically, he was there at the 3-week mark. And then when they went back 3 weeks after that, he was gone. So he was there less than 6 weeks. So I don't know how many times Heath would have made it out there, but the movie seems to kind of portray it that way. Also, so it's very interesting because the families of Heath and Moroni Clausen, I know that they're still all in the area. It's very interesting. You can look up stuff about them. But actually, Heath, his great grandson, I think, is a lawyer in Salt Lake City. And he said, yeah, the movie takes some liberties because it tries to paint this picture that Heath, the police officer, had this dark past and things like that. And that's why he connects with Baptiste. But in the Deseret news articles from 1863, just a year after these events took place, it doesn't sound like Heath is very warm and fuzzy about Baptiste. He seems to, he calls him a coward, and he doesn't speak of him like, oh, this is somebody, and I know it's only been a year after that, but still, it's interesting that the movie kind of paints it that way. But I still think it could be worth seeing because it looks like it's put together really well. So that is the story of the grave robber turned ghost, John Baptiste. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.